Happy Star Wars Day. Today is May the 4th, and so I wanted to make a video because I'm a massive Star Wars fan. I've talked a lot about Star Wars on the channel. It's my favorite film franchise and favorite just sort of sci-fi property in general. But what I thought I'd do is rank the movies, rank them in my order of preference. This is not a list that suggests that I'm right and you're wrong, even though I am right and you're wrong. Totally kidding. Everybody has their own sort of subjective take on this, but here's my ranking of all the Star Wars films. I think for a number of people, the first movie on their list is Empire Strikes Back, and for me, that is indeed the case. I think it's the most polished of all the movies. I think it's got the most sort of cinematic and thematic depth. You know, if you think about Star Wars as a space opera, this is the one that's the most operatic, if you want to look at it that way. Even though Revenge of the Sith has an actual opera, this one's very operatic. It's got a lot going on. I think it's got one of the most iconic moments in film history, not just in Star Wars history, but in film history, if not the most iconic moment in film history. That's debatable, of course, but that is, of course, Vader revealing to Luke that he is his father, but it does everything right. It's got sort of this dark tone. It builds on what happened in the original film, and I love The Empire Strikes Back. I can watch it over and over again. It is a little bit dark. It can be a little bit hard to get into for some people, but for me, it's the best one. Next on the list is the original film, the one that started it all, Star Wars, or as it was sort of later titled A New Hope, or given sort of the episode number of number 4 and then the title A New Hope. I think it embodies what's great about Star Wars, right? I mean, it really set the tone for the franchise as a whole. It's really sort of a space comedy. I wouldn't say more than anything else, but it does that really well. I mean, you've got the introduction of every major character essentially in the saga. I mean, obviously there are ones that come down the line that we don't have in this movie, but you've got Luke, you've got Leia, you've got Obi-Wan, you've got Vader, you've got really the whole lot. And you've got Chewie as sort of the sidekick there to Han that's kind of comedic relief, but you've got 3PO and R2, and just everything about it is great. It really pushed the envelope in terms of special effects. It set the bar for what was possible with that, and even today, all these years later, it looks fantastic. Anytime this movie's on TV, I end up watching the whole thing. Of course, I've got, the entire trilogy, the original trilogy on DVD, on Blu-ray, even on VHS. I haven't watched the VHS versions in a long time, but it's one of my favorite movies of all time. I think it's one of the best movies of all time. It's really sort of up there, kind of neck and neck with Empire, in my opinion. But yeah, it's hard to beat that original film. This is where things get a little bit interesting with my list, and I thought long and hard about this, but my third favorite film in the entire franchise is The Force Awakens. Now, to me, this film has endured a lot of criticism, especially when it comes to being similar to the original Star Wars movie, A New Hope. It's got a very similar plot line, but I think it had really kind of a tough job, which was to introduce a new generation of fans to Star Wars, and to make them familiar with what that universe feels like while also doing something new. And so, to me, this is a really good marriage of sort of old and new. Now, I think the best Star Wars property to actually do that really, really successfully is The Mandalorian, but today we're talking about the movies. And so, The Force Awakens, to me, is the best of the sequel trilogy and even the best of anything that came after the original films. And Return of the Jedi, of course, is on this list. It's a little bit further down, but I love The Force Awakens. I think it's a great movie. I think all the characters are great. A lot of people have pushed back against Rey and some of the other sequel characters that were introduced, but I love them all. I think it's great. And one thing to note about this list, I love every Star Wars movie, or at least I enjoy every Star Wars movie. Some of them, as I get further down, maybe I don't like quite as much as the others, but there's something about that universe and that world. It feels tangible. It feels like something you can really engage with. If there's a movie set in the Star Wars universe, even if it does a lot of things wrong, if it gets the tone right, if it's an interesting story, I'm more than likely going to enjoy it. But I think The Force Awakens is a fantastic movie. I think all the praise that it received from critics upon its release was absolutely warranted. Again, it's third on my list. Next on my list is Revenge of the Sith. Now, the prequel trilogy did a lot of things really wrong. There's a lot of wooden dialogue, a lot of, in my opinion, kind of bad acting, not necessarily from, for example, Ewan McGregor. I think Hayden Christensen is maybe doing the best he can with the dialogue he's given. But again, there's a lot of stuff that's stilted there, but Revenge of the Sith just feels like a really solid culmination of this sort of transition that Anakin Skywalker makes to Darth Vader, and it just works so well. The final duel you get between Obi-Wan and Vader, in my opinion, is iconic. A lot of people kind of hated on the prequel trilogy when it was a new thing, and I remember seeing this in theaters when I was finishing my master's degree in grad school, and walking away from it thinking they finally got this right. You know, even though I didn't love Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones, and I'll talk about those here in just a moment, but Revenge of the Sith, even though it's got a lot of that same sort of tone to it, it just takes it up a notch. And it feels like the movie I was kind of waiting for with the prequels. And so it's a little bit long, but you really feel like Obi-Wan and Anakin are brothers, and they lose that relationship. And there's just so many things that go well with this. And I think the manipulation of Palpatine when it comes to Vader is just expertly handled. And so, yeah, it's going to be the next movie on my list here. The fifth movie on my list is Return of the Jedi, and I'm sure that's surprising for a lot of people. Again, I love it. I think the way it wraps up the original trilogy is superb. It works really well. I do think there are some things about it that I didn't love, especially in retrospect. You know, as a kid, I thought it was a great movie. I even, as a child, though, didn't necessarily like it as much as the original movie and Empire Strikes Back. The Ewoks are fine. You know, I do think them taking on the Empire and somehow winning is comical, personally. I think that does drag down a little bit of the credibility of the film, you know, and I don't want to talk about believability because we're talking about a world where, you know, people can use something called the Force to make objects move around and have laser swords and all that sort of stuff. But that whole dynamic between the Ewoks and the Empire, I thought was just a little bit, you know, just too unbelievable maybe. So in general, it's got a lot of great things going for it though, right? I mean, you think about Jabba the Hutt, you think about that final battle on the second Death Star between Luke and the Emperor, the space shootout, the dogfight in space with the Millennium Falcon. I mean, it's all great. It felt a little bit redundant maybe when you look at it in regards to the first two original trilogy movies ultimately. That's maybe why it's a little bit lower on my list. But again, a fantastic movie, and it's really hard to hate on it. Next on my list is Rogue One, right? And this is falling really kind of squarely in the middle of the list. An excellent war movie. A dark, gritty movie. It sort of took me by surprise. I wasn't sure how well it would work, but ultimately great characters, and you really feel the weight of what they're trying to accomplish and what they have to sacrifice to get there. You know, I remember seeing this in theaters, and I remember walking out, and I just adored it and thought it was really well made, a great Star Wars movie. And I remember my wife saying, I really liked it, but man, was it heavy. Man, was it sad. And so I think for a lot of people, that kind of drags it down a little bit. That didn't really impact me all that much. The one thing about it that I do think maybe is not going to hold up over time is the sort of introduction of CGI versions of past characters. So specifically Grand Moff Tarkin, right? And at the very end, you get a CGI Leia. They mostly look good, but that was kind of a jump the shark moment for me when I saw it in theaters, and it is still a little bit jarring. It's just not quite there with the technology. I think it's cool that they included them, and I think it makes sense within the larger story of Star Wars, but it just isn't quite there, right? And so for that reason, it sort of falls in the middle of my list. But again, Rogue One is a fantastic movie. Next on the list is The Last Jedi, and this is probably the most divisive of all Star Wars movies, I would say. I really appreciate what Rian Johnson was going for here. I think this idea that Luke is kind of a jaded character at this point who wants to isolate himself. He feels like, you know, this whole sort of dogmatic view of the Jedi, to go back to some episode 3 language there, is problematic. And so, you know, I really had no problem with the way they handled Luke in this. I thought it was kind of an interesting direction. You know, you kind of expect him to be the person who shows up and saves the day, but that to me is a little too formulaic and maybe not true to life. So I liked what Johnson did here. The one thing about this movie that I thought really felt sort of tonally off base from the rest of the film was the casino planet that they end up going to. I think Canto Bight is the name of it. That whole sequence and that whole side story I thought really dragged the movie down overall, and as I sort of get more removed from the film, I really start to dislike that component of it that much more. I like the idea of what they're saying with Benicio del Toro's character of, oh, you know, there are good guys and bad guys, but really a lot of people are just in it for profit, and it's kind of a gray area. But I think there could have been a way to make that whole thing be a little bit more reduced and not quite as cheesy and weird. And so, again, it just didn't mesh with the movie overall with me, but I did generally like The Last Jedi. Next, we've got Solo. Again, you're going to be seeing a video coming out soon where I talk a little bit more about this and how I would love to see a sequel to Solo, but I think it's a great movie. Maybe not fantastic, but fun and good, and it is just sort of a lighthearted piece of entertainment that I really enjoyed when I saw it in theaters. It is a little bit long, I think, but as it progresses, I found myself really getting sucked into this world. Again, this is one of those movies that when it's on television or when I see it maybe on something like Disney Plus, for example, I just sit and watch the whole thing, even though it's a long movie. I just love it. I think the casting is great. Again, a lot of people, I think, initially just sort of dismiss this outright because Harrison Ford was not playing Solo, but it's a prequel story, and so how would you do that? Have a CGI Harrison Ford who's younger? I mean, that wouldn't work. So I'm sure some people would argue, well, just don't tell that story. It doesn't need to be told. But I don't know. I really had a lot of fun with it. I think it adds some depth and additional lore to the Star Wars universe, and so anytime that happens and it's done well, I'm all in. The next movie on my list is Rise of Skywalker. It's the conclusion to the sequel trilogy. Again, a good movie, an entertaining movie to me, but I can see why a lot of people had issues with it. I do think that in the grand scheme of what the sequel trilogy was trying to accomplish, it feels a little bit rushed. There's a lot there that needed some additional explanation, especially when it comes to the Emperor, right? We get a couple of throwaway lines about how he's here because of, dark magic and science that only the Sith were aware of, but I need a little more depth than that, right? I mean, we definitively saw the Emperor die in Return of the Jedi, and then suddenly he's back as sort of this clone, and it turns out that he was sort of puppeteering what was going on with Snoke the whole time in the sequel trilogy. That component of Rise of Skywalker drags it down a little bit to me. And I don't mind the Emperor being there as the bad guy. I just need some more explanation. I wouldn't have minded this having been a longer movie if we got that. As it was, it felt a little bit rushed. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, I do think the weight of Rey sort of taking on the Jedi mantle and all those generations of Jedi and sort of facing down the Emperor, carried the film in the end. And I think the way that they worked Leia into it after Carrie Fisher's passing worked well. It was really sort of a movie magic thing to me, the way they were able to do that. So a little bit lower on my list. Ultimately, I was, mostly satisfied with that conclusion, but it does have some problems. Okay, now we're getting into the two movies that I think are equally not as good, in my opinion. They're really kind of interchangeable, I think, when you get to the bottom of this list. The first of these is Attack of the Clones. Some really cool battle sequences. You get Yoda jumping around like a CGI spider, which I don't think was the wisest thing. I think Yoda worked well as sort of a tangible special effect, a tangible puppet like we had in the original movies. There's some interesting geopolitical stuff going on here, but I think, again, that's sort of the overarching problem in a lot of ways with the prequel trilogy. It's so bogged down in politics, and I guess that's kind of the point, to show how, the galaxy reached the point that it did, but it feels a little bit weighty. And again, this has got some of the worst dialogue, or I'll just say outright, the worst dialogue in all of Star Wars, right? When Anakin's talking about sand and how much he hates sand, and he says things to Padme like, no, I love you more. No, I love you. It's just bad. It really is just bad. Now, again, it's Star Wars, and because of that, it's somewhat enjoyable, but both this and The Phantom Menace, in my opinion, are really at the bottom of the list when it comes to Star Wars movies. And then again, as I just mentioned, last on this list is The Phantom Menace. And what is there to say about it? It's got some cool sequences. And I remember seeing this in high school. And there had been no Star Wars movie since Return of the Jedi at that point. There was a lot of hype and a lot of build-up. And if you're my age, almost 40 years old, you can remember this. I remember going to see it in theaters and walking out and thinking, there was some cool stuff there, but what? And so I think in my mind at the time, I was trying to justify how much I liked it and why there were some good things about it. And I think, for example, the pod race is great. I think the duel of the face at the end of the movie is a good thing, but it is really stilted ultimately when it comes down to it. Anakin is this whiny kid, and there's a lot of stuff about midichlorian counts, which I guess that's fine, whatever. But in Jar Jar Binks, I don't want to keep hating on Jar Jar Binks as a character. I think he's gotten enough of that over the years, but he really does drag down the film, in my opinion. So this is the worst of the lot. Anyway, that is my semi-definitive ranking of the Star Wars movies. This could change over time, and of course, as more films are released, which I think eventually they will be, and this does not take into account television offerings such as The Mandalorian, The Bad Batch, which starts today, I believe, and other things. So let me know what you think. What are your rankings of the Star Wars films? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching.